Welcome to Afikra Conversations. It's my honor to introduce our very special guest, Ussama Makdisi, professor of history at Rice University. Ussama has published many books on sectarianism, Post-Ottoman Empire, and history in the modern Middle East. These slides are going to come back up in a few minutes, but I don't want to waste any time with our special guest, so we're going to get started right away. Ussama, thanks so much for joining Afikra Conversations.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't know if you can hear me or if we're having technical issues still.
I hear you perfectly. I'm going to wait until the rest of my laptop gets up and running, but I'll make it work for now. Okay. So I guess the first question is, you know, you grew up between the Middle East and so between Lebanon and the States. How early on in your life did you think to yourself, I want to become a historian and I want to specifically study this region that you call
home? Probably growing up in the civil war in Lebanon, it had a huge impact on me. I mean, it definitely had a huge impact on me. In terms of actually studying history, I think it was probably in college. I mean, I knew when I went into college that what I was interested in doing, and I gravitated naturally to history courses, and I ended up, working on, as you know, on Lebanon and on the history of the Middle East. I think initially I had a fantasy of being a biologist, a marine biologist, but nice. Then I was walking with my father in Beirut during the war, and I'll never forget this, we met some professor from AUB whose name I cannot remember, who was incredibly depressed. I mean, things haven't changed much. Actually, things have changed a lot, but was incredibly depressed during the war and just looked at me and said, why do you want to do biology? There's nothing in biology. And I don't know, for some reason that put me off completely. And but I was a boy then, so I don't think there was a specific moment. I think just growing up in the war, in a very academic family, I think I just gravitated towards history.
Yeah, and were you immediately drawn to trying to understand sort of the backdrop of what led to the situation you were living in Lebanon? Were you trying to make sense of the world you were born into, or were you sort of drawn towards American history and European history and the history of Africa, or I know that the focus of your work has been Lebanon and the surrounding areas, but if I spoke to 15-year-old Ussama or 21-year-old Ussama, was that also your sort of academic obsession at the time as well?
I think that developed. I think I certainly knew that there was an experience that I had lived through and that many of us have lived through that was not captured in any way, shape, or form by what I was reading about in the history books about Lebanon and about the Middle East. And so I think there was a sense of responding to that and really trying to write an empathetic history of in other words, a history that took seriously the perspective, the views of people in the region, that didn't just stereotype them. Because I knew, the one thing I knew for certain was that growing up in West Beirut, in a mixed, obviously profoundly mixed and a beautifully mixed and diverse, in American, what the Americans say diverse, we didn't use that term back then, but in a beautifully sort of area, in terms of Muslim Christian mixture. It was so natural. It was so absolutely natural that there was this commonality. And then the constant discussion of the war in Lebanon as a religious war, especially back in the 70s and 80s. It was always described as a Muslim Christian war. I knew that something was wrong and that I wanted to correct that sort of image or that representation of our history. And so I think that propelled me on. But in terms of, I was interested in I'm much more interested today, I would say, to be honest with you, I'm much more interested today in US history than I was when I was 15, that's for sure. But remember, we were not taught any of this history in high school in Lebanon, absolutely nothing. We were not taught our own history, we were not taught US history. we aren't taught any history. We're just taught this kind of ridiculous, ludicrous, history. I think of, great Western white, French Revolution, kind of a very quick thing of the French Revolution. It's just the most ludicrous history that we were exposed to.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because when I hear you talking about, you can see the screen now, right? At this point. Okay,
yeah,
great. If I sort of zoom out at some of the books you've published, just because I couldn't read the introduction properly, the names of some of the books that you published, starting at the oldest is The Culture of Sectarianism, Community History and Violence in the 19th century Ottoman Lebanon, Artillery of Heaven, American Missionaries and the Failed Conversion of the Middle East, Faith Misplaced, The Broken Promise of U.S.-Arab Relations, 1820 to 2001, and the most recent, Age of Coexistence, the Ecumenical Frame, and the Making of the Modern Arab World. All of them seem to be this meditation on how did we get here, essentially. So let's zoom back and give sort of set the stage, if you will, of what the sort of 1800s Ottoman Empire was looking like, and the contraction that was happening and reshuffling of the empire that was happening, and what that meant for folks in modern day Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, and Jordan. So if you can give us a little bit of a framework to understand where your head was at when you started writing Age of Coexistence.
Okay, so you want a history lesson in a few minutes. So basically, I would say that, as you can see from this map, I'm assuming all our viewers can see the map as well. That basically, as everyone can see, this used to be what is today Lebanon, Syria. This whole region was, of course, part of the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century. And so to say what was it like to be in the Ottoman Empire, I mean, it depended, of course, on which part of the empire you were in, what class you belonged to, which city you were in, and so on and so forth. But by and large, just the most basic, obvious point is that you belong to a single sovereign or a single sovereignty, which of course was located in the person of the Sultan in Istanbul. And the Ottoman Empire was an empire. It was an Islamic Ottoman Empire where Islam was legally and ideologically privileged over other religions, but non-Muslims, Christians and Jews, and many other groups, heterodox groups, existed obviously in this empire, and were not sort of, contrary to the myth that we grew up with in Lebanon, again, about the oppression of Christians. It's not that the Christians were oppressed. It depends which Christians, when, which groups, when. I mean, everything is contextual. But there was ample space for Christians and Jews, non-Muslims, Ahl al-Kitab, to sort of practice their religion. But of course, this was an Islamic empire, and it was profoundly unequal. There was no citizenship. There was no equality. And this is the point I try to make in the book over and over again, is that when we think of coexistence, we have to distinguish between the age of coexistence that I'm interested in, which is the 19th century, 20th century, our current contemporary situation, where the ideas of equality, political equality and citizenship, secular equality arose, and previous forms or iterations of coexistence or chronologies of coexistence that predate, of course, especially in our part of the world, that go back for centuries, but in a period or in an empire where there was no political equality or citizenship. And I think it's important to really insist on this point, because most people who talk about coexistence conflate a history of living together with a history of equality, and those are not the same thing.
Yeah, I love your use, as you talk about it, your use of the word equal, unequal parts, because equality sort of as a term, although they're obviously directly related, equality has sort of lost any sort of meaning in today's world. But using sort of derivation equal, I think, is really, really effective in actually driving that point. You talk about 1860 and how that's a pivotal time, but it's not only pivotal, it's also maybe misunderstood and misremembered. Can you talk a little bit about what may have happened and what people sort of think happened in common parlance?
Well, to be honest, I don't think most people think about 1860 at all. I think most people don't think about the history because we don't have. This is one of the great sort of like issues that I struggle with, and most of us who work on the history of the Middle East struggle with, is that, you know, I'm located now, of course, as you said, I'm located in Houston and Rice University. At the moment, most professional historians that I'm aware of are located outside of the Arab world, or if they're in the Arab world, they're not located in what are robust research institutions because they've been starved of funding, because their work conditions are incredibly onerous, especially in Lebanon today, as everyone knows, with what's going on there. And so there's a sense of, there's a history. People just don't have the time to really delve in or think about this history. And the point about 1860 that I said is, I mean, one of the points about the book Age of Coexistence is that I'm trying to write a history of coexistence that's not simply romantic, or we all got along. It's really like a meditation. You use the word meditation. I like that word, Mikey. It's a meditation on how the transition from a state of formal inequality, and not just the inequality of non-Muslim to Muslim, but the inequality of all to the Sultan, because this was, of course, this was a sultanate. This major transition in the 19th century was obviously fraught, and the problem, the way people have typically understood, at least historians have typically understood 1860, is that they focus on the fact that Muslims in Damascus, for example, in July of 1860, massacred Christians. It was, and there's no question, there was a huge anti-Christian riot. And it's sort of a scandal until today that we don't have a single, as I've said this time and again, we don't have a single proper history of the massacre of 1860 in Damascus, let alone what happened in Mount Lebanon, which is sort of a related but separate affair between Maronites and Druze. But the issue, we don't have a single proper history of the July massacre, the largest single anti-Christian massacre in Syria in the Ottoman period, that actually uses Ottoman sources, or that actually sort of writes a robust history in Arabic. There's nothing, because we don't have. I mean, because we were so afraid, in our part of the world, to write these kinds of histories, lest we be accused of being sectarian. And so what we did is we essentially abandoned this to Orientalist historians who wrote it either became memoirs, so people wrote recollections of 1860. They became sort of private narratives that were passed from generation to generation by those who were affected by this incident. But we didn't have the conceptual vocabulary to write about these kinds of issues and contradictions and problems without feeling exposed to undermining some kind of national unity. And so we end up not writing a lot of our history. It's not to say that our history is all violence, but all history is both beautiful and terrible. It's a combination of these things. You can't have beauty without terror. And so at some level, we need to grapple and confront with these histories in their complexity as honestly as we can, and not leave it to others who don't understand our part of the world. I'm not trying to be a nativist here, but because you don't have to be an Arab to write about the Arab world, but you need to have some profound empathy, it seems to me, to write a history that can evoke these kinds of moments without saying that the Arabs or the Muslims are barbarians, which is the way the Orientalists wrote about 1860. So they wrote about 1860 as if nothing had happened in the West, as if there wasn't a US Civil War, as if colonialism doesn't occur, as if like the massive pogroms weren't occurring in the West and in Eastern Europe, and so on and so forth. So I really wanted us to write a history of our own problems, in a sense, our own problems of coexistence, empathetically. And this was the last point I'll say on this point is that 1860, of course, is a key point of departure in the book, because after 1860, as a result of this massacre and the massacres in Mount Lebanon, Butrus al-Bustani famously issued his clarion, the clarion of Syria, Nafir Suriya, to basically appeal to people. He realized that people were profoundly affected and traumatized by the sectarian violence of 1860, whether in Mount Lebanon or in Damascus. And he realized that people have a choice. Either they're going to continue down a sectarian path, or they're going to have to elaborate a new humanist, anti-sectarian sensibility. And he pushed for the latter. And he opened the school.
Can I ask you a semantic question?
Sure.
About this? Because, okay, so Bustani establishes a school, right? Madrasa al-Watan, or what is it? The national school.
Yeah.
And so I want to ask you about two words. This book is actually how I first encountered, I've told you this before, this book is how I first encountered your work, because you wrote the foreword to this republishing of it. And the word national school is an interesting word in an Ottoman context. And the word and the phrasing, a patriot's call against a civil war. So who was Bustani patriotic towards, and what is the nation he has nationalism towards?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. I mean, I go into this in great detail in the book, but it's not what people, so you have to distinguish between national and nationalist, and there's a difference.
Great.
So Bustani was a national in a loose sense of in his specific understanding of national meant that Muslim and Christian and Jewish, presumably Syrians, by which he meant everyone who lived in what was then a part of the Ottoman Empire, including what is today Lebanon and Syria and Palestine. All this region basically shared in his view, a culture, a common culture. They breathed the same air, they spoke the same language, they belonged to the same culture. On the left of the screen is an example of Nafir Suriya, the pamphlets that he issued immediately after the 1860 massacres. So the idea of a national is the idea of commonality. What brings us together? It's a very specific idea of what brings us together as Muslims, as Christians, as pious people, but also as secular people. So there isn't a separation of piety in Bustani's view and secularism. They go together, they go hand in hand. It's not the religion against the secularists. It's that they're all together. They all constitute building blocks, but in his view, equal building blocks. And this is what was different, of a new revitalized nation. And hence the idea was not to denigrate others, but to actually sort of stress what everyone has in common, which in his view was a pious humanist religious tradition, whether it was Muslim, Christian, or Jewish. And that's why Bustani broke with the American missionaries with whom he had been associated, because their view of progress and civilization meant that everyone eventually had to abandon what the missionaries considered to be, inferior religions or corrupted religions, and convert to a very specific form of American evangelical Christianity.
Yeah. Can I ask you another question about Bustani? Because as a figure, I find him to be quite fascinating. I was interested to see, or surprised to see, that the school that he established really only was in existence for 10, 15 years. How can I reconcile that fact with his outsized importance?
Well, because he embodied the era in which he lived. He was an embodiment. If you just look at the picture of Bustani himself, he was an embodiment of an Ottoman moment. There he is wearing with the fez. He has the medal from the Ottoman Sultan. He was recognized by the Ottoman state. He embodied, I think, perfectly one aspect of the Tanzimat, the reformation of the Ottoman Empire, this transition from being an Islamic empire with non-Muslim subjects, unequal non-Muslim subjects, to being an empire of all its citizens, which is a paradox. And the empire ultimately wasn't able to sustain that paradox. But Bustani's idea of a national, again, to go back to that question, was that we're all, irrespective of our religious differences, we can all be common citizens, patriots, abna al-Watan, of a single nation, which in that era meant, of course, under Ottoman sovereignty. So it's true that his school didn't last for a very long time by modern standards, but it lasted a long time. It's still not insignificant, and it was emblematic, I think, of the fact that the empire itself. So he opened the school before the Ottomans had a public education system, before their national educational system was established. His school and his work was recognized by the Ottoman state, and it became, in a sense, Not that it was a direct, it's not that they copied him, because in the end, he really was interested in moral piety and national awakening in a way that the Ottoman statesmen were not. They were interested in preserving their state. And for them, sovereignty was much more important than equality or anything like that. So in other words, for the Ottoman statesmen, equality was simply a way, or non-discrimination or citizenship was a way to get to an end, which was powerful Ottoman rejuvenated sovereignty, as opposed to Bustani. But he was a template, he was an embodiment of this moment. I think it's really important to underscore this point, that he really embodied this Ottoman moment, at least one facet of this Ottoman moment. And the fact that he is Christian is, I think, is incredibly important. But we shouldn't just reduce him to just being Christian. So I think this is some part of the paradox or the contradictions or the tensions of Bustani.
So I want to ask you about the subtitle of your book, The Ecumenical Frame and the Making of the Modern Middle East, a Modern Arab World, excuse me.
Yeah.
The term ecumenical frame, why did you land on that? That's obviously very intentional. Why did you land on that phrase?
Because I've used it before. I mean, I've used ecumenical before. In my previous books, actually, it's in there as well. Not the ecumenical frame, but ecumenical, because I think the idea of ecumenism attracted me, as opposed to secularism or as opposed to religion as such. In other words, what's really profound and beautiful about the idea of ecumenism or the ecumenical is the idea that you recognize difference, sectarian difference, and at the same time you also recognize the possibility of transcending that difference without denying difference. You transcend into what you hold in common. And so that idea of the ecumenical, as opposed to the secular, which is always posited as opposed to religion, or you see what I'm saying? So that in that sense, the ecumenical really, I think, captures our part of the world, the Middle East, the Mashriq, much more so than secularism does. And it's frankly, it's a term that also gets us beyond the debates about secularism and whether secularism is Western or whether it's European or Christian or whatever. It just gets us beyond that. It's also a term that's been used a lot in the historiography. People talk about Islamic ecumenism. People talk, of course, about Christian ecumenism, but the ecumenical also means the world as is. It's a reference to the world as it is. And so I think there's a sense of accepting difference, recognizing difference, and at the same time trying to transcend that through national unity, for example, without pretending that everyone is the same, or without pretending that Christmas and Ramadan are all the same, or you know what I'm saying, like that there are differences that we maintain, and I think that's something really important and something to be cherished.
Do you want to hear a joke that I came up with last year? You know how people in Lebanon always love to congratulate ourselves that there's like 16 different sects, or I think it's 16 different sects in Lebanon. I wish I could change everyone's phrasing and say that there are 16 similar sects in Lebanon because I feel like, I mean, who are we kidding? They're like just incremental changes. Okay, post-Ottoman Middle East. There are two of the figures that you take a look at. One who I was familiar with, Michel Chiha, and then al-Husri in Iraq that I was not familiar with. Give us a little bit of information about who these figures were and why they are worth looking at, and how did you come across them? How were you drawn to them?
Well, I mean, I know these are both very, as you alluded to, in case of Chiha, for Lebanese, Chiha is obviously a well-known figure, controversial figure, or a venerated figure, depending on what perspective one follows. And Husri, of course, is a huge figure in the Arab world and also in Ottoman pedagogy as well. So he was an Ottoman figure. So these are both very well-known figures for those who know the history of the late Ottoman Empire and the Mandate era. And what I tried to do in this section of the book is to say, look, since the ecumenical frame, this idea of modern coexistence rooted in a sense of equality with all the tensions, and the first half of the book, of course, I talk about all these tensions, or some of these, not all, but some of the tensions some of the contradictions, the elisions, the silences, the fact that the form of coexistence that gets entrenched in the Mashriq is really a conservative, ultimately a fairly conservative form of coexistence that deletes and elides a lot of history to make a in a sense a public sphere that is allegedly non-sectarian or transcends sectarianism. But there's all sorts of censorship that goes on in this. So I'm not trying to, again, I don't want to romanticize this period, but it does allow for a kind of an ecumenical sense of being Arab, being Lebanese, even being Syrian, in the modern sense, that we really should not take for granted, this idea that you can be an Arab and be Muslim and be Christian, and until Zionism, be Jewish as well. All of this is crucial to understand in the Ottoman, it took shape in the late Ottoman period. And then, of course, what happens is that the British and the French come in, the British primarily, and they devastate this region. They divide it up into various mandates. We are, and the we, as in the Middle East, is among the last places in the world to be actively colonized and perversely colonized in the name of self-determination. And then the question is, okay, so how do you relate to this new sovereign, new territorial map of the Arab world, where you have the states of Iraq, Mesopotamia initially, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria? These are all created as mandates. How do you relate to this, the ecumenical frame, the idea of sovereignty, the idea of religious difference, and how do you deal with it? And so the reason I focus on these two figures is that they adopted, I would say, diametrically opposed views, and I tried to bring Iraqi historiography and Lebanese historiography into conversation, in the sense that they're rarely juxtaposed, because we often compare Lebanon to Syria or Lebanon to Palestine, but we never, and most of all the Lebanese compare it to Lebanon alone, because they almost never think, I'm sorry, with all due respect, it's, but like all peoples tend to be insular, and they tend to think of themselves, and we tend to take the Lebanese borders as some kind of sort of, as if these borders have always been there in history, and of course they haven't. And there's a lot we can learn from comparing and thinking about other parts of the world, including our own part of the world, again, which most of us, including myself, are incredibly ignorant about. I mean, most of us don't know very much about most of this history. And so for me, it was a learning experience. But Husri, of course, was an anti-colonial, a profound anti-colonial figure. He was an Ottoman. Turkish was his first language, or at least his major language, Ottoman Turkish. And then he became fluent in Arabic, but he moved from being an Ottoman nationalist pedagogue to being an Arab nationalist pedagogue. So he created and set up the Iraqi educational system, as well as the Syrian educational system, eventually emphasizing principles of secularism.
Does he work very closely with Faisal? And I mean, how does
Yes, he works closely with Faisal. He's absolutely works with Faisal, and he ends up in Iraq under Faisal in the 1920s. But of course, Faisal was a British creation in Iraq. So there's always this tension. Husri himself is profoundly anti-colonial, and basically takes an Ottoman nationalist anti-colonial vision and now has to work within a much smaller territory of Iraq, where the British are the ones who actually run the show. And then you have the Hashemite monarch, who's dependent upon the British, but is trying to build an Iraqi state. And then you have, of course, Sunni, Shi'is, Kurds, all these different groups inside of Iraq. And Husri is trying to build a strong national state. This is his vision, his dream. And how do you build that state? Well, his approach was to say, okay, focus on children, focus on nationalist education, and sort of basically drum this. We would consider it crude, but nevertheless, it was an incredibly important and very important anti-colonial narrative, with limitations, with blind sides, with blinders. But it was a genuine attempt to build a strong educational system. And he's been, of course, savaged incredibly unfairly since. People today call him sectarian. They say he's anti-Shia. Like they take what's happening today and they push it back to the 1920s and 1930s. And that's a problem a lot of our history, is that we tend to start from today and look backwards, rather than appreciate what these people were trying to do at the time. So his vision was an anti-colonial secular vision, as opposed to Chiha's vision, which was also coming out of an Ottoman milieu, but a very different interpretation. His idea was philo-colonial, pro-French, and to create, as we all know, the sectarian sort of architecture of Lebanon. And the idea was that there would be a state without a majority, but a state of what Chiha called associated minority communities.
And pro business and just
and absolutely, like it's not a strong state at all. It's actually a state that is completely dominated by the business interests and it's a state that we see. Of
so
course.
he was successful.
Well, he was successful to an extent, but the point is, like, what happens oftentimes is that we tend to dismiss Chiha because he was philo-colonial, because he was sectarian, without actually trying to really grapple with the kinds of sectarian thinking. He wasn't just a sectarian, he wasn't like Bashir Ismail. He wasn't that kind of right-wing, sort of, like, there's a difference. We have to appreciate the fact that this guy was offering a vision. We can disagree with it completely, and I disagree. I mean, it is a kind of a completely philo-colonial vision, and obviously it was self-serving, but it's nevertheless a vision that you have to contend with. And Husri, of course, was contending with it, but in the Iraqi context. And all these people understood that there was any which way we could go, and we had to figure out who we were first and what we wanted to be. And so that's why I sort of juxtapose these two visions, because oftentimes Lebanon is compared to, like, the Lebanese are the sectarian, like Shias compared to the Zionists. I just think that's just a total misreading of the fact that both of these individuals had an ecumenical vision. One was confessional, the other one was secular. Both have problems. Honestly, Chiha, as I said, was far more philo-colonial, Husri anti-colonial. Put them side by side and try to see what you can learn, rather than immediately dismissing them.
So I want to ask you two questions and then move on to our quick Q&A. Sure. I'm curious about, and I'm going to try to keep your answers somewhat short, because I think a lot of questions are going to emerge. The first is, how do you sort of, what is the purpose of your work internally for yourself? Are you trying to understand the past so as to offer policy, as you did, policy recommendations as you did in this book? What is driving your work internally, not externally?
I mean, they're related. I don't think I have. I mean, internally, just who I am. It's the kind of work I love doing, and I believe in this. Honestly, I actually genuinely believe in this kind of, in evoking this history, because I know that there are certain aspects of who we are and that I treasure, and certain aspects of who we are that I absolutely abhor. And I'm much more partial to the ecumenical, the beautiful part of our history. And we do have beautiful history. So much of the Arab world today, honestly, Mikey, and Lebanon, is just people are understandably depressed, crushed, broken, because the people who run the Arab world today are tyrants, are despots, are vicious, and the sectarian class in Lebanon is no different. It's a vicious, completely, like, they've created a dystopian world. And my point is to remind people that we have a beautiful history, not to go back and romanticize that history, but to say that our history it's not that we have failed, it's that we are in a particular moment in our history. And that you asked me earlier about U.S. history. The point is that U.S. history, people in like Adonis and all these other sort of great figures, honestly, they don't know the history of the West. And if they knew the history of the West, they wouldn't say such absurd things as the West is better, because that's just an absurd ahistorical statement. The West has its own problems. Racism is profound, deep. And I talked about 1860. Well, in the United States at the same time, there are 1860s times 100 that most of us are not aware of. And so my point is, let's actually try to sort of grapple with our own history on our own terms. Let's be the authors of our own history, as opposed to always looking to someone else. That's really it.
Great. Okay, my last question is sort of taking a look at the Ussama that published this first book, The Culture of Sectarianism. If I think about what you know now after having done the work that you've done, how do you think you would have informed, or if today's Ussama was the editor of that Ussama, what would be the notes that you would have given?
Keep the sentences shorter. You mean like what? How would I have changed? What would I have changed?
Yeah, like what did you?
I think I was more.
You must have learned some stuff.
Yeah, of course I've learned. I'm much. I mean, I would say on the one hand, I'm much less optimistic. I mean, I really thought. I guess I underestimated. It's one thing to talk about to deconstruct, which is what that first book was about. To say, look, sectarianism is not age old. It's obvious. If you just know a bit of the history and you study the Ottoman documents, and you go through the history, you'll understand why and how a sectarian system was first created in Lebanon. And it wasn't because of some ancient history. It's because of a very particular set of factors that occurred in the 19th century. So I think that's important but I think what I didn't appreciate as much is just how many people in the face of, I mean, I guess I knew this, but I guess maybe I was in denial. How many people in the face of overwhelming rational evidence and history and just arguments, just in the end are not interested, and they're going to continue to believe what they believe, irrespective of what you say. So so for me, my greatest joy and pleasure, honestly, and now at this point, is to have a community of people who care about the region, and beyond that, I'm not interested in trying to convert people towards my perspective. And like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, I'm not. I believe we each have to say what we have to say, be voices in the wilderness, so to speak, and beyond that, I don't have any illusions about changing anything. So it's not that I have a policy prescription, because it's not for me. I believe in just saying what I have to say, in writing what I want to write, in conversing with the people who care about the region, and then beyond that, it's not in my hands.
Sure. Well, if you're looking for a community, the afikra community is ready, willing.
There you go. Well, that's why I'm here.
Okay, let's do this quick Q&A. I'm going to try to keep you to 2 minutes-ish per question. What are you reading or watching right now?
I'm preparing for class, so it's going to be Du Bois, and C.L.R. James and Edward Said and UN resolutions. That's what I'm reading right now.
Cool. Yeah. That's great. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
To shadow for a day, past or present. My imagination is not so. I would say Muhammad Ali, if I had to shadow, but from a distance.
Which one?
The great athlete, the greatest, but from a little distance, not too close. Yeah. But yeah.
Cool. What do people most misunderstand about your work?
They think that I'm opposing religion as opposed. They always conflate sectarianism with religion, and they don't understand that sectarianism is a political phenomenon. It's a historical phenomenon, not a religious phenomenon. So people always confuse religion, conflate, and that, of course, that's deliberate, because that's what the sectarian ideologues always want us to do, is to conflate sectarianism with religion and religious difference. So you can have religious difference without sectarianism. You don't need sectarianism to have religious difference, and you certainly don't need a sectarian state to preserve religious difference. That's a myth.
For sure. Okay. Whose work do you admire or are inspired by? Obviously, the list is long, but if you were to pick one or two.
I mean, for this audience, honestly, if I'm absolutely honest, for this audience, in terms of Middle East, I mean, there's so many different authors, but, Edward Said is clearly like a huge inspiration. He was my uncle, of course, too. So it's a little different, but every time I read his work or teach his works, I should say, it's extraordinary, and how unappreciated some of his work has been in terms of how far ahead of its time it was. And at the same time, how much, yeah.
Is there a piece that's maybe a little overlooked that you say, go check this out, you probably haven't read it yet?
Yeah, in fact, I was just reading before I came on here, I was reading his rebuttal in Critical Inquiry in 1989. I can forward it to you, Mikey, but there's a rebuttal. Like he wrote, I think he gave the address to the Anthropology Association. I think it was 1980 something, late 80s. And then there was a response by the Boyarin brothers, Daniel and Jonathan Boyarin, and another guy called Griffin, and Edward responds in Critical Inquiry. It's one of the most extraordinary responses of how to respond to criticism, to people who refuse to to deal with the moral humanist aspects of your argument and sort of, like hide behind their fingers, so to speak, rather than engage with what you're actually saying. So yeah, I can forward that to you.
Yeah, I could use that.
I'm sure you could.
Okay, first question comes from Samuel. Are you there?
Yes, hello.
Go for it.
Hey, Samuel, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And I'm delighted to have been able to listen to this conversation. Thank you very much. I wondered if I could ask you about your own linguistic background, the languages that you have, that you grew up speaking, the languages that you studied, and how that has informed your work as a historian, and what it has enabled you to do.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Samuel. Samuel was a former student of mine at Rice, so I'm like very appreciative of hearing him and listening to him. So I grew up in a bilingual household. Mikey referred to the fact I was born in Washington, D.C. My father was working in the U.S. at the time. My parents moved back to Lebanon when I was a young boy. And so I grew up in Beirut. I went to IC, International College. And so I grew up, as I said, in a bilingual house. My mother mostly spoke English to us, my father Arabic. And of course at IC, I was both Arabic and English, and then French was a third language. But I think the fact that my English is what it is, my brothers and I, all our English is what is because of my mother and how much she invested in teaching us and reading to us in the midst of war, to be fair. So I think that had a profound impact on my writing and I would say my approach and my outlook.
Great. Afzad?
Yeah, I would like to ask Doctor, what do you see the future of Middle East? What it will be in coming days? What do you think of it?
What's the future of the Middle East? The future of the it's probably more in the near and the immediate future, more of the same, but probably worse. But eventually everything changes. This is the other point of history. The other beautiful part about history is that everything changes. And just because now we're in a particularly dire situation doesn't mean A, that we've always been here, and B, that we're always going to be here. I know that's not much solace for people, but that is the reality. I mean, we have to always remember that we're not worse or better than any other people. We have our particular situation now, but this will change. I have absolutely no doubt about it.
Great. Usman, you're up next.
Thanks, Mikey. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you for the talk, Ussama. It's very interesting. I wondered if you could expand a little bit further on sectarianism as a kind of modernizing movement in the Arab world, because in your works, especially your early works, you do talk a lot about, the fact that the Middle East transforms itself, but it's also through the prism of sectarianism that it effectively modernizes. And you've also written previously about how translations from European languages into Arabic translates certain ideas about sectarianism, which becomes the dominant form in the region.
Yeah, I think this is, thank you for that question. I mean, I think actually there's maybe a misunderstanding. And I think it's important to clarify this because it's one of the things I think that often gets misunderstood. I say that sectarianism belongs to the modern period, the modern age. It's not that it's modernizing as such. It's not that sectarianism is more modernizing than secularism or national or sort of anti-colonial nationalism. These are all projects that are born in the 19th century. And that, in other words, we have to think of them as part of our modern experience. So I think that's what I would say to that. It's just one of several different options, mediated, of course, by European colonialism, as all our modern history has been, by European and today US imperialism. So all these things go together. It's not that sectarianism my point is that it's not age old, is that there is no primitive, ancient sectarian system. You won't find it. You won't find the word, and you won't find the political culture that sectarianism pretends to offer. So I'm not saying, I want to be clear about this, I'm completely, utterly opposed to political sectarianism because it leads to a dead end. It really does lead to a dead end, and it ends up reifying religious communities as political communities, and it undermines any possibility of transcending sectarian difference.
Okay, Talat?
Yes, thank you very much for this talk. I would just like to ask you, Ussama, after thanking you, of course, for this inspiring talk, have you come about the discourse of race during the period you are engaging in the post-Ottoman period? And if so, how do you come up upon characters like Rashid Rida, Muhammad Abdu, al-Shidyaq, and their, what I might call the post-nativist, post-Puritan discourse about the Nahda? And if you see, مثلا, Muhsin Jassim al-Musawi discussing the idea of Nahda in the literary scene, how do you see that? How do you think the idea of race, the racial discourse, is engaged during that period?
Yeah, I think that's a huge question, and that's a really important question. And I don't think I can do justice to that kind of question in this really quick format. But what I would say is absolutely there are sort of discourses of race, but my caution, and this is what I really want people to think about, the caution I have for anyone is to remember that we have to be attentive, and I've said this over and over, and I'll say this again, we have to be absolutely attentive to the histories of our part of the world, of the Middle East, in other words, and try to conceptualize the history of the Middle, and that's another reason why the ecumenical is so important. We have to sort of theorize and conceptualize our histories on our own terms, and not start borrowing, which is what's happening now, I feel, what is contemporary, what always happens, what is contemporary in Western academia, whether it's, and so we take, so now there's an obsession with race, understandably so, of course, in the US context. And then we want to translate all these ideas immediately into our part of the world. So I am much more sort of, it's not, of course, there is race and there is racism, but I really want us to be, to historicize these issues as much as possible. So that's my unsatisfactory answer to I think a really important question.
Great. I think the next one was from Zane, but it looks like she just dropped off. So Yusi, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah. Hey guys. Thanks for this. It was super cool. I don't really know this period of Lebanese history super well, but the only book I read about it was Engin Akarli's The Long Peace. I don't know if you read it, but
yeah, of course.
Huh?
Yes, of course I read it. Yeah.
I don't know. And he kind of, I felt like he kind of posited, like, I always thought it was a funny title because it's like a 60-year period and he's like, it's such a long piece. But he kind of posits that like sectarianism isn't like wasn't a foregone conclusion until the French. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering if you think that's like an overly kind reading of history. And then my other question is kind of like, how can we use, I think like your vision of this period to like create a Lebanese national narrative today that has like a political will to be more inclusive, or is that overly ambitious?
No, I mean, it's not about it being overly ambitious. It's what you and others presumably have to struggle for. People have to struggle for, and there's no such thing. I mean, everywhere in the world, as you know, there is a war against justice, a war against equality, a war against freedom that takes different forms in different parts of the world. And the point is, you're always, anyone who fights for justice and equality and freedom is always going to be, in a sense, on the, has huge odds placed against, against him or her. So it's really that situation. In terms of Engin's book, I think it is an important book. And remember, it was one of the first books that dealt with the Ottoman archives and applied it to Lebanon, or the history of Lebanon, which up until that point, assumed that the Ottomans were simply irrelevant, or they were just oppressors of the Lebanese. And Engin sort of reminded us of the importance of the Ottoman period. I think the issue with the book, of course, like a lot of Ottoman history, is that they tend to have no theorization of power whatsoever, or of violence, or of state, the violent nature of modern states. And but as I say, take what's good from the book and leave the rest aside. So take what's good from that book. There's some good things in that book.
Great, thanks, Yussi. So Ghada asked me to ask her question, but I'm going to expand it a little bit. She asked, how do you see Kamal Salibi's explanation of history? I'd actually like to expand it to say, are there other histories both for Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, that you recommend people check out? And then even broader, are there other histories that are on the same subject but in a different location in Iraq, in North Africa, and Sudan that we may not be aware of on this call that you said, check this out, this scholar is doing great work, this scholar is doing great work, for us to take a look at?
Okay, the first part is Kamal Salibi. Again, so like I have, again, I try to read books. I don't always succeed, but I try to read books and try to take what's good out of the positive out of them and leave what doesn't serve me. Sounds like a yoga lesson, just abandon what doesn't serve. But what I like about Salibi's work, I mean, there's clearly an evolution of Kamal Salibi. Remember, he was a student, if I'm not mistaken, he was a student of Bernard Lewis. And he was very much adopted, I would say, an Orientalist perspective. The idea of like you study only your part of the world, you don't study other parts of the world, and that's a real problem. And so, but nevertheless, Salibi was a major scholar. He contributed a huge amount to narrating a certain vision of Lebanese history. And to his credit, he corrected himself. He went into autocritique as a result of the civil war. So if you compare his early works with his last major work, which was A House of Many Mansions, there is definitely a sense of autocritique, like a criticism of self, an awareness of that. But it's still, nevertheless, for Salibi, there's still this idea of Lebanon apart from everything else. And for me, that's always the point is we really have to think about the Middle East, whether it's Iraq, the person asked about Iraq or Syria or North Africa, whatever it is. Also read, and there are many historians, and I don't want to be unfair and single out one historian and say read this person's work. There are a lot of fantastic people writing, especially people who are empathetic, who understand, who care about our part of the world, and who are not there to cover up its ills, but are there to try to historicize its ills. But do it out of love and out of passion, not out of sort of hatred or denigration or self-loathing. And that's what I don't appreciate. The point is that read also and understand that the West, Europe, you asked me earlier what books I'm reading. Eric Foner, Reconstruction, a phenomenal history of Reconstruction. I mean, these histories, once familiarizes oneself with the histories of racism in the West, colonialism, and so on, and really reads about how complicated the transition to equality was and how contested it's been, especially in the US, and here at Rice in the South. It's unbelievable. The history is so much richer and
continues to be.
Yeah, of course, than what we're taught. So that's why when people say, "Oh, we've failed," I say, well, we haven't failed at all. We're in history. We're living what we're living. But think about the United States, which is infinitely richer than Lebanon, a much greater state, and yet you have these extraordinary racism in this country, violence on an epic scale here, and that's the richest country, the so-called richest country in the world. So point is, everybody has issues. The question is, how do you narrate your history with empathy as opposed to self-hatred, or as opposed to Orientalism, or as opposed to sort of romantic Islamism or romantic minoritarianism? Really, that's what it is.
Cynicism, yeah. That's absolutely right. Ussama, this has been an absolute thrill for me. Thank you so much for joining. I apologize for the technical difficulties up front. Thank you everyone for joining the call, people from all around the world. This was really a treat. I hope you had a good time. On Thursday, we have the poet Khalid Matawa on, who is absolutely fantastic as well. So please join that, and see you all next time.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Ussama.
Yep. Bye-bye.